everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Titanic Month. Well, as you've seen on my YouTube channel now, I've done episode 1 and episode 2, and we're going to focus on the aftermath after the sinking because yesterday is the 110th anniversary. But I thought for today's podcast and collab, I thought I would just dive in to focusing on post-traumatic stress disorder. But who person to talk to about it than my good friend Claire Carmichael. Claire, hello.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited.
Oh, you're welcome. I mean, I was thinking about you to be on my podcast for such a long time, and then when the idea of it came to me, I thought, I know the person who should go first. I'll bring Claire on. But it's really wonderful to have you on, Claire. I mean, it is a serious subject, really, when it comes to post-traumatic stress disorder as well. And it's not really an easy subject to talk about, especially if it happened, really, because when you really look at it, it's kind of like a taboo subject in a way.
Yeah, you're right. It is quite difficult. And from my job sort of point of view as well, as a nurse in clinics, when I'm seeing people and I know they've got PTSD or anything like that, if I have to talk about it, I'm sort of very careful when I talk about it because I don't want to trigger anything and them to have a sort of PTSD sort of event or something like in my room if I've triggered a response in them. So it can be difficult, I think, from that sort of side of things as well. The more we sort of are open and we do talk about mental health and anxiety and PTSD sort of comes under all of that. I think people will feel more comfortable talking about it and not so ashamed, I suppose.
I mean, it's really hard to tell because when you look at today, really, I mean, there's more awareness about it. But when you look at something back to 1912, it didn't exist. It really didn't exist at all.
Yeah, it's a very different time back in 1912, I think, with mental health and things. Yeah. And different sort of mental asylums that people were put into. You don't get that sort of thing now. I think it's a lot more understood and a lot more better treatment and better management for it, I think.
Definitely. But we realised we haven't let you to introduce yourself, Claire. So do you want to introduce yourself?
Sorry. So my name's Claire and I'm a registered nurse. I was a GP nurse for 2 years, but I've just recently changed jobs. I'm not allowed to sort of speak about my role. It's very confidential. But I'm still seeing patients every day. I'm working from home and I'm doing sort of assessments still on the phone with patients. So doing like physical assessments and mental health assessments and things like that on the phone as well.
It's very tough as well when you are working from home because I can imagine it's not that easy at all, really, especially since most people are used to face really just before the dreaded C word event happened.
Yeah, I know.
I mean,
and I know a lot of the restrictions have been lifted, but in healthcare they're still sort of keeping the restrictions just because cases and things are rising. So I'm on the phones at the minute, but once things are relaxed, then we will go back to our clinic setting, just from the new job that I'm doing. And I'll be doing home visits as well, which would be nice.
Oh, that'll be good. Yeah, I mean, it would be nice just to get everything back to normal. But this is like the most tricky thing just to talk about, really, because you wouldn't really get something like this. Well, like back in like the time, really, because PTSD wasn't really a thing. I mean, any medical stuff wasn't really a thing, really. Even though home visits were available at the time, you had to pay for them before the National Health Service even existed, really.
Yeah, back before our NHS started, people had to pay their doctor down the road, or normally it'd be like a family doctor that people would see. You didn't really hear much about nurses. It was very much a doctor's world back then, I think.
I mean, it's really hard, really, when you think about it, really, because I cannot imagine living in a place like that, really, where you always have to pay for medical stuff all the time. People wouldn't afford to have healthcare, really, because there will be people who are working in builders or have low paid jobs. You just don't have something like that, not back then.
That's it, yeah. And those people would just suffer. They'd just be left to suffer.
Mm.
or well, and die in some cases because they just can't afford healthcare.
It's really like hard to believe, really, and also the support as well. It is so difficult just to realize that it does really make you think about what what kind of support is there really, especially with like with some cases really. And I know that when everyone looks at PTSD, they didn't really call it PTSD around that time, even before like the two world wars.
Yeah,
Normally the people would refer it to as shell shock because they're like,
yeah,
ah,
that's
it's just for
true.
the soldiers only. And then
Yeah,
now
that's
everyone, it just,
yeah,
yeah.
that's it. Yeah, and with I think as we've learned more about PTSD, we're finding it's not just people that have been like at war and things like that. It's anyone really that's had a traumatic event in their life, any form of abuse or anything like that that they've been through can, or car crashes, for example, people having miscarriages or stillbirths can really trigger sort of PTSD. So
Mm.
yeah, I think when people think of things like that, they always think about soldiers and war, and people in the military do suffer from it quite a lot. But actually anyone could get PTSD at any point in their life.
And then it's always really, really. I always found that with like the Titanic, when PTSD, that some of them were mentioned, but they were never really dug into really because
Yeah,
there are just so many events really that it did like really traumatize people, whether it was like men, women, children. It really traumatized them. And I know that even though I researched with so many cases, I thought that I would only just drop down to three really, because I found that some of the cases were really, really interesting.
yeah,
And I mean, all three cases were like quite different towards each other, but they really hit hard the most, really. And I know that
yeah.
it's never easy just to talk about them, let alone just try to find the support as you go, like get older, really, especially if you're a little child as well.
Yeah, that's true. And I think back in them days, um, people were probably, they didn't want to say that they've got this PTSD or they've been affected from something like that because there was probably that stigma attached to it. And there's probably, because of the mental asylums that they had back then, that you were seen as this insane person and things like that. So there's probably that fear that people didn't really speak about it and they didn't want to get help for it, maybe because they didn't want to be judged. And I know it's the same today, but I think we are speaking a lot more about it today and there's a lot more awareness about it. So it seems a little bit more, people are coming more forward and being a bit more open about it, maybe. Whereas back then, it just, you wouldn't speak about it because, like I said, that stigma attached to it.
This is like one of the things, and I know that with one of the cases that I looked at, and that this was back in an interview, a news interview that was back in 1979, I would think. Yeah, we'll go with that. 1979. There was a case study. Well, not a case study. There was an interview where oh, I couldn't say who it was, class wise, but there was a passenger, Eva Hart, and she was only 7 years old at the time of the disaster. Oh my goodness. It's one of the most heartbreaking stories I've ever heard when you think about the children, because being only 7 years old, I can imagine she had really serious PTSD. And when I was looking into her story, and of course, her father died in the sinking. And one of the things that did traumatize her was not only seeing her father, actually watching them going into the lifeboat and then being lowered, and then before that he told her to hold mummy's hand and be a good girl, and she was screaming, and
Yeah,
she was screaming. It's like she wanted to call for her dad, but of course men couldn't really come into the boat because of their gender at the time.
yeah,
But the really biggest thing that I found in the interview, that she said that after the sinking, she went to a church service with her, I would say with her family, and there was a hymn called Nearer My God to Thee. And when they were playing it, it was actually, she said it was the same tune in the church that she heard when the Titanic band played during the
Yeah.
sinking, and she got so traumatized that she ran out of the church and couldn't go back in. And she was
Yeah.
only 7 years old, and I don't know what happened after that, but eventually around that time she did manage to get therapy, and she overcame her fears of the Titanic, and then for the rest of her life she just talked about it and accepted interviews about it, which
Yeah.
I thought it was a really interesting story.
That does sound interesting, yeah. And PTSD will affect people completely differently in different ways as well, and how people respond, I suppose, to being triggered and having that trigger. But it's so sad at 7 years old having to go through that. And it's nice that she's overcome that and had the therapy and things as well. It's quite nice to hear. I need to look up these cases because they sound really interesting. It'd be really good to look at them. And
There are many case studies like that that are absolutely heartbreaking and terrifying, maybe even interesting actually, because I was doing some research. I was talking about this to about a one guy, and I got notes here because, oh my gosh, this guy, his name is Frank Prentice, and he was a shopkeeper, but oh, he had like one of the most interesting stories that he actually was actually right close to the events where he was actually in like all those events where you could hear and feel. He was right in the middle of it all, and when he was older, he'd said that he would never take his children or anyone in his family to a baseball game. That was when he moved to America. Well, no,
yeah,
that was Frankie Goldsmith, actually. Yeah, Frankie Goldsmith was the same. He said he wouldn't take anyone to see a baseball game because the roars when the crowd was screaming reminded him of people drowning in the ocean. And this was the same with Frank Prentice. He actually investigated stuff before he knew the ship was sinking because he heard like this whistling sound, and it was a vent, I believe. I might have to look back in the story, but it was a vent in the vault where one of the funnels is, and that's how he found out about the sinking. And then when he helped put women and children in the lifeboat, he helped like a first class passenger, and she didn't want to leave her husband at all, and he just said to her, your husband will follow you in a minute, and you just got to get in the lifeboat, you'll be safe. So he did allow her to do that, but he stayed on board, and he jumped right off the rail all the way down, managed to miss the ship's propeller as it's broken, as it broken in two, and he was right in the water. And all around him, he was in the middle of where the 1,500 people were screaming and crying for help, and they were all drowning right in front of him. I mean, most of them were wearing life jackets, but
yeah,
because of how the temperature of that
yeah,
water was so cold that night,
yeah. Bit hypothermia.
most of the people didn't really survive. And the most tragic thing was he was picked up by a lifeboat, and I think it was only a few, or it was the only lifeboat to ever come back for people who were in the water.
Yeah. Oh gosh, sounds horrible. It is amazing how the mind works as well, I think, and how it can bring back so many memories with different events and things like that and trigger responses. Um, yeah, but like I said, there is a lot better management for it with mental health services and psychologists and medications and things like that, which can help manage CBT as well. But back then, I'm assuming they wouldn't have had anything like CBT therapies or anything like that.
No,
It's a shame.
no, it is really a massive shame, and I don't know what happened with him after that, really. But the most interesting thing about it is like the anger that he felt not long after, because there was like a case really where he felt like the crew on the bridge, he thought the whole sinking was their fault.
Oh,
And I mean, it was really interesting to see how someone could blame like a crew, like a group or a member. But I think it was a way of trying to actually I wouldn't actually say just to like help him cope with PTSD, but
Yeah.
it's just something that he felt he wanted to get his emotions out there.
I suppose it's like a coping mechanism as well, isn't it? And trying to find closure for something like that that's happened. And
Mm.
yeah, such a shame.
His story, it's really interesting just to have like a deep dive into it really, and I never really touched on his story much, but I was really blown away, and I could really understand from his interviews why he was angry, why he was afraid, and I cannot really imagine if you were in that cold ocean water and you only had about like 20-30 minutes to survive and
Yeah,
people screaming all over around you. It's
yeah,
well, it's so
horrific. Yeah, just can't even imagine.
no.
Mm.
And I also find that the women in the lifeboats and the children, their husbands or brothers or fathers, they could have drowned, and
Yeah,
it just really makes you stop and think really. And I know in the James Cameron film as well, it depicts that really, really hauntingly, really, and also A Night to Remember as well, the old film. It really just picks up on that. And I thought to myself, can you imagine going through all of this?
yeah, yeah. And surviving it without your loved ones and having to live with what's happened, it must be tough. Yeah.
There was loads of people who would never speak about it, and there would be like, if people wanted to speak about it, some people like, no, don't have anything to do with it. I want nothing to do with it. Just move on from that.
I
I
think
mean,
that's maybe a way of them coping, maybe as well, by just not speaking about it, blocking it out. It didn't happen to sort of avoid those emotions, maybe. I don't know.
yeah, I mean that does sound like it to me, because
Yeah.
I always knew that there are some people who are scarred, and I know there was one person who refused to give interviews from journalists even years later. She said, "Why do I want money to talk about the Titanic? I lost a father and three brothers on there. What more do they want?"
Yeah. She's got a point. Like, no amount of money is going to bring them back.
I wouldn't blame them because I know that. How do you put this into words? It's kind of like you don't really want to. You don't really want to express emotions about it much, really. They're kind of like bottled up inside, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know that that's the thing that's important. But then another case, but this is going to be the last one because I found something, because that was published in a journal, and I don't know how to pronounce this one, but it's a section called "In the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry." I think I really don't know how to pronounce that word at all.
Is it psychiatry?
Yes, that's the one. That's it. Yeah, I'll definitely go with that. I think that definitely sounds right,
Sounds
really.
about right.
Yeah, but this was a really shocking case, really. It was never named that lady who actually was part of the study in the journal, and this was back in 2001, because you're talking about that study that was published about like 20 years ago now, and
Yeah.
there was this lady who was referred to under an alias name, but it was believed that it could have been passenger Alice Cleaver. And what happened was she was in a nursing home, and poor thing, when she was in the nursing home, she had dementia, and she had other periods of extreme physiomotor agitation. I think that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah.
But so it's kind of like fits of like dementia um, or maybe memory loss as well, because she didn't remember any members of her family or her daughter at all. But there was one case when she was in the nursing home, and when she was put in the day room, she really did not like it at all. And once she was in that day room, she become stressed, and when she becomes stressed, she would say, "The water is coming up. Go to the lifeboats. Save the children. We'd
Oh.
all be dead."
Oh, so she's clearly reliving it, isn't she, in her mind?
Mm, and,
Possibly there must be something in the day room that triggers it,
mm.
maybe.
Yeah, it never really explained why that was the case.
Yeah,
And the person who published the journal, she was unclear if the survivor who was mentioned was genuine. But having a look over it, I think it must have been, because who else would you actually look or investigate into when it comes to trauma situations like this?
yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it?
It's so heartbreaking just to see so many of the people who were mentioned in the episodes, that some of them did actually get the help they need, but it was also tragic that some of them never actually told how they got help, if they did, or maybe if they wanted to keep it private, or if there were other ways that they would express it. It was I always found that these case studies were so interesting, but
Mm.
I never really thought that the Titanic and the Titanic disaster and PTSD have a lot in common, but it's never mentioned a lot really. And I think, like when you talk about PTSD in other cases like the world wars, or in any a kind of war or a bit of situation, or like you said before, Claire, accidents, it
Yeah.
it just makes you think really that if like most sessions and the therapy sessions and some help that you would get today were originally back to early, about over a century ago, what would you say that if services were like that were introduced over 100 years ago, what would they be like, or how would they be different or the same, or that sort of thing? Really, I know I'm not really making any sense, but it's just trying to figure things out in the head.
Yeah. I'm not sure, to be honest. That's a really good question. I'm not sure what services would be like if the same services now were back then. Um, I'm not sure. But I think if they did have the services, it would be a massive benefit, I think, to a lot of people. And it might have helped, like that lady with the dementia that you were saying, might have helped her in some way.
I know with Alice Cleaver's story, I mean, it's difficult really when if you are remembering at a traumatic event like this, but you have dementia and you can't remember anything else. Just
Mm.
imagine if she did get help, but she can't remember anything that happened in a previous session, and if the memory's still haunting her, you're stuck really, aren't you, when you think
Yeah.
about it?
I suppose she'd be stuck in a loop. Yeah, yeah, that's true.
I mean, it's really awful, and I can't imagine ever being in a situation like this, really. But any with the case studies, really, it's really shocking just to see how much has. I don't know, really. I don't know how to put this, but there have been a lot of changes since that event, really. And then while some of them may have got help, some of them may not, it still feels interesting that none, like nobody, not even historians or descendants of survivors, will want to talk about it, because it's either a bit traumatic for them as themselves, or if it's a subject of taboo, or if there's some historians who thought, okay, I'm not really interested in that. I just think it's a real shame.
Yeah, it really is a shame. I don't know why they haven't spoke about it.
Oh, I know that with you, Claire, you've worked with clients with PTSD. So, we're looking on how you actually work with clients with PTSD. What would you say that if you were to help or one of the people we mentioned, how would you help them in your own experiences?
Yeah, so when I've had patients in clinics, like normally I would do their mental health review and see how they are, and if the medications are effective. I would check their bloods and things like that, blood pressure and everything, just to make sure that's okay. And if I ever, 9 times out of 10, most people were okay because they had the CBT sessions. They were under a psychologist or a counselling services or something, so they're okay. But I think there's probably one person maybe where I've had to refer them on to mental health services just because they were really struggling, and they hadn't had that support. But apart from that, they were all okay. I haven't really had to have much input, if that makes sense, other than going through the reviews and blood pressures and things like that, and making sure they're okay in that way. Sometimes like referring to like breathing techniques that they can do. So if they find they are having an episode where they're getting really anxious or triggered, then signposting them to like breathing techniques and things like that online that they can do as well has really helped some people.
These are so brilliant, actually. I mean, if I ever had to go for a session, breathing techniques are amazing. But it's really interesting that you would like have blood pressure with some of them. Really, I wonder why it would be the case.
Yeah, so we check blood pressure. Sometimes it's because of medications. So the like they might have anxiety medications or something like that that they're taking that can affect blood pressure. Sometimes it's the anxiety and stress and life that's impacting their blood pressure, so they might have a high blood pressure as a result. But most of them were okay, which is nice.
Oh, I mean, it's really really good just to see that if they are on medication, then that could be beneficial as well, really, because medicine has come a long way as well since then,
Yeah,
really.
yeah, definitely. There's so many different medications now that different doses, different medications, they all have different side effects and things that you have to be mindful of. Um, that's well, that's down to the doctor. I don't do medications. I just check them and make sure they're not having any side effects from them.
But it's always like good just to have like some of them in the long run, really. But if you have a look at them over a century ago, the medication they will be given would kind of be dangerous, really, especially if you like give them something like mercury or lead or something.
Yeah,
I cannot imagine, really, if you were to go help in that time after a traumatic disaster and a doctor or a nurse prescribes you with medicine that's got very dangerous chemicals in, that
yeah,
could that could damage the health a bit more, I should
yeah.
think.
That's it. They didn't have any like half of these medications back then. I'm assuming, I don't know for facts, but I'm assuming they'd be more like a drowsy sedative sort of drug they probably give them to help calm them down, maybe. Um, don't quote me on that though, because I'm not 100% sure. But there was definitely not all of these medications options that there is now.
Hmm. I mean, it's really, really like interesting to see with all the like different periods as well, really. But imagine having to go like all through that from a century ago compared to now. Loads of things have changed, really, and especially that there'll be lots of things that have happened or will happen in time. And I think it has come a long way away, really, to actually help patients. But I always feel like if I ever go back in time, I would
Yeah,
definitely actually grab one person from the past, bring them into the present world, and say, we'll give you all the help you need, really. And I wish I
yeah,
could hug you for that as well.
that'd be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds so cliche, but it just feels
Nice.
like you want to give a person a hug, really, because that's just one thing that you want to do. And with all the stories of like, I just wish I could give you a hug after going through all of those experiences.
Yeah, it's just sad. It's really sad. It's a
Mm.
shame.
It is really, but I know that with so many stories like that, it understands of how the situation during the disaster was really, really serious, and it gives them a very important reason to why there are some hidden topics that people are not really interested in, and they'll be like, oh, it's nothing important. But actually, it is important because this is something that goes on through everyday life now. And
Yeah,
there, like you said, Claire, earlier, there's more awareness out there, there's more help, there's more hope. And it would have been something that should have been really, really beneficial a long time ago, really. But we just got to be grateful for what we have now, really,
yeah,
in any
that-
situation like that.
yeah, exactly. And that's it. And I know Titanic was a very horrible, nasty event, and people suffered, but we still have that now, just in different ways, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, it definitely makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think people just go through so much in life and have had really awful events happen to them. Um, but like you said, it's so much better now for mental health services and medications and just life in general. I think people are more open about it, like we were talking about. So it's nice that we've come a long way, but we've
Yeah.
still got a long way to go.
Oh yes, definitely. And I hope one day in time there will be more people who would talk about things like this really. And but in any history event, I wish that medicine and history would like collaborate together, but hopefully they will in time. And this is the one thing that I'm really hoping in the near future, even though it's never happened in the past, really, because
Yeah,
it it's very important, and it because it's not part of medical history, it's also part of world history, and it's just
yeah,
getting the sense of like the understandings of everything that's happened throughout the years. Really, very important events, very important things that people go through, even accounts as well. They're just so important in a way, and this is why something like talking about PTSD following the Titanic disaster, it's so important to talk about.
yeah, definitely. Yeah. And the more we talk about it, the more awareness is out there, the better I suppose people feel about coming forward about these things. Because I think some people still now are too shy maybe to come forward and say, I'm really struggling with PTSD. I know a lot of men in particular really struggle with emotions and because they see themselves as they have to be this macho man, they're not allowed to show emotion in a way. So I know there's a lot of statistics in men's mental health as well at the minute and trying to raise more awareness and getting people to be more open and speak about it to sort of prevent something like suicide in the future. So it's really important that we do things like this to raise awareness.
That's it. I mean, just jumping on from that actually, because you just reminded me of something. Because there have been like many cases of Titanic survivors who are men. Only about like I don't know how many, but there were many of them who committed suicide after surviving the disaster. One of them was a guy called Frederick Fleet. He was the one who spotted the iceberg from the crow's nest with the
Oh,
famous line, "Iceberg right ahead." That's him. But
yeah.
oh, his story is so tragic. He felt so guilty
I bet.
after
Yeah.
having like survived, and his wife actually kept him going after the disaster. But when she died, her brother, who was living with him, evicted him, and he returned to his garden and he hanged himself in his garden.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's so sad.
Mm.
It's really, but it would. I mean, if that was me, I think it would absolutely play on my mind as well. Like the whole events. I think it's just human nature, isn't it, to naturally beat yourself up and feel guilty for things. And I don't know if it's human nature, but I tend to do it a lot in life anyway. So I can imagine if I was in that position, I know I would feel guilty. And yeah, it's
Mm.
such a shame that that happened.
Yeah, I mean, it is really tragic, but then also you got like the different cases like getting yourself into car crashes or taking your own life in so many ways, really. And it was really surprising that many of the cases were men, but of course, because I blame the rules of the sea for this as well, because that played its own part of it, because the rules of the sea at the time was women and children first, and they there was absolutely no section in the rule where it actually cared about men. And I think that's one of the main reasons that I blame for this, really.
Yeah, I think that's society as well, isn't it? Like different generations and things, different timelines in the past. Men have always been seen to be the provider, the strong ones, and women have to be looked after in a way, and women and children should always go first, and things like that. That's just been a society thing for a long time, I think, and I think more needs to be done to sort of break down those sort of I don't know, traditional society things that we go through. I don't know how to say that.
Oh, no, no, it's okay because it is hard to explain. It's really hard to
Yeah.
explain when you have to go through different situations like this. And
Yeah.
I know that. It's really awful, really. And I know that when I went to do the documentary, I was trying to. There was this cemetery in Southampton called Hollybrook Cemetery, and I was really trying to find Frederick Fleet's grave because there was a tombstone that was put in nearly 20 years ago that was erected in memory of him by the Titanic International Society because apparently before that happened he was buried in a pauper's grave, and I was trying to find that because I was told about it, so I thought, oh, let's see if we'll find it because it is a little bit of a historical landmark apparently, but hopefully I didn't say it the wrong way really because I am a bit worried about that, but I didn't find it in the end. But there was one grave, oh, it really broke my heart. It was still kind of like a, not, I wouldn't say a pauper's grave, but it kind of reminded me of when you people are buried during the COVID-19 pandemic, all they got is just a gravestone or like a sign, and their coffin and all that is buried under like gravel stone like you use on pavements. And because it happened so many, it was just like that. And on the cross of this guy, I can't really remember his name now, but I can remember on this cross it says nothing except Titanic survivor, like no like date of birth or anything. It was his name and Titanic survivor, that was it.
So they didn't find who it was.
No, they didn't really he was named, but I really couldn't really remember his name really. But I just thought to my mind, that is so tragic, and it really broke my heart. And this is just something where that's. I mean, and more needs to be done about this, really. I think, really, but it's just so tragic, really. That, like you said before, Claire, the men are like the more affected really as well when you think about it, because so many of the passengers are affected, but I'm thinking that it's the men that's been affected a bit more.
And yeah, like we were saying, men sort of hide their emotions with things like mental health, so then it's just going to have a knock-on effect and it's just going to get worse, I suppose, as a result. It's a shame.
Yeah.
But, yeah,
Yeah.
more
I mean,
needs to be done,
yeah, more
definitely.
needs to be done. Yeah, I mean, like, but I know we definitely have come a long way, but then I think more should have been done really back then. But I know that we can't turn back the clock and there's nothing we can do. But
Yeah,
even if there are things that need to be changed, we just got to be grateful for what we have.
that's it, exactly. And I know we can't change the past, but we can learn from it as well and make change in the for the future so it doesn't happen again.
I mean, it is like something like, wait, that's definitely needs to be remembered for. I think we definitely are in the same boat there.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we'll probably wrap the interview up in a second, Claire. But I know
Yeah.
that before we do, there's one question that I have been asking people. But how do you think the Titanic should be remembered? Like in terms of like what we're like talk about in terms of like remembered like with the stories, or if there's life lessons from that.
Oh gosh, I think a lot of things. I mean, it was a tragedy. Is the main thing. We all know it was a tragedy, and I should hope that lessons have been learned from it. And I think that people have looked into the ship itself and what happened and the events leading up, and so hopefully that won't happen again. Um, but also the bravery of people, the bravery of the people that stayed on the ship and didn't want to get into lifeboats because they wanted to stay with their families, and yeah, and the people that survived as well, like how strong they must have been to get through every single day knowing that their family weren't with them, and they've lost people, and they've still woke up every day. Like that lady with dementia, she's got to that age by getting up every day and surviving each day following an event like that is quite a strong thing to do, I think.
Yeah, I
That
mean,
makes sense.
yeah, that does make sense, absolutely. I mean, and it's just something that it is remembered in one thing, but it could have been remembered in another way, just to have like more help and support. But I think that that's the like tension for so many events like this, not just the Titanic, but for the whole of history in general. And
Yeah,
that's where, like with medical stuff and all that, we are grateful for it now. But
yeah,
it's also important to remember that if it happened like that, like how many years ago it was, the history
yeah.
and things could have been different as well.
That's it, yeah. And yeah, like you said, the things that need to be changed is the support afterwards as well for people to help them. Maybe if the support was there back then, people may still be alive now because hopefully they wouldn't have died by suicide. I don't know. If they had
Mm.
that support, we'll never know.
No, I mean, some of the things are privatized, really, but I think whatever happens, really, I think even though with PTSD and there are other connections like hiding yourself away or suicide or anything like that, it's always important to remember that it's always an important reminder of just how help and support can benefit so much to so many people. And I know, Claire, you have been amazing to talk about throughout all of this, really, with every single like bit of it, really. And I honestly, I've definitely learned a lot from your own
Oh.
experiences, really, because I've never heard so much stuff like this before. So yeah, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you as
Oh,
well.
thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. And we'll definitely wrap it up there. And Claire, thank you so much for coming on today. And I'm so happy I finally got you on the podcast as
Yeah,
well.
me too.
And especially like shit, it's the month for the month. It's during the month as well. And I really cannot speak, and I don't know why. I do apologise. But
I'm the
yeah,
same.
I mean, it was absolutely brilliant. And I think, to be honest, I'm so glad that I actually got to talk to you about it, Claire. And I'm so glad to actually get this film. So thank you so much for Claire for
Oh,
actually
thank
participating and being amazing. That
oh,
really
thank
truly means a
you.
lot.
Thanks a lot.
Oh, you're welcome. And until then, guys, I will catch you in the next episode, which I don't know if it will be episode 3 or if it's another interview, but I'll just see you whenever. But I hope you have a wonderful day, guys. And until then, I'll see you very soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye.